it's not relevant, I'll just remove.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, William, for giving us a presentation today. We highly appreciate. In the talk we had before, you were telling me that you're also an active member of our group, and I really appreciate that because I think it's good if we have speakers from our group to show the potential of research that we have already in our group. Perhaps you can introduce yourself shortly, and then I'm looking very much forward for your presentation about women's manager leadership and its relation to social capital and intersectionality. It seems to me like a very interesting topic and a very interesting approach to applying social capital. So I'm eager to hear your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for providing a platform. My name is William Etti. I'm a practitioner, scholar practitioner with over 20 years of experience in the public sector and 5 years of experience in the academic sector. I can begin my presentation now if everyone is ready. Okay. So the title of my topic is a case study of women manager leadership advancement in General Schedule 13 through 15 pay scale within the federal government civil service. Later on, I would expound on exactly what does General Schedule 13 and 15 mean for those, for individuals who are not in the federal government. So you might think I'm a man, so why will I be interested in women leadership? Specifically, or underrepresentation of women leadership in general. I was being given an award for a 10-year service award in the US federal government. And as I was on stage, there were about 100 of us. I was only able to capture a very small fraction to make sure that actually I would show in the picture, I am the one here. And as I looked to my left, I noticed that there were woman to my left, another woman to my right, couple of men, and significantly my peers were all women. However, when I look further down to the individuals who are sitting down, who are men, these are the top leaders. So these women are oversaturated in the pipeline for top leadership roles. However, the top leader tend to be homogeneously male. And this is what spurred my interest in women leadership. So through this research, I will talk about my background, the purpose of the research, my research questions, significance, literature review, theoretical framework, methodology, limitations, and practical recommendation. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a practitioner, scholar practitioner. So how does this really help in the workforce itself? So background. Generally, we know that women make up 59% of the federal civilian workforce, meaning the US federal government. The US federal government is the second largest employer next to Walmart. So that's a significant amount of personnel. Historically, as we know, women are underrepresented within the US federal government as well as internationally. But even more so, women are underrepresented in the Fortune 500 leadership positions. So why are they still being underrepresented 20 years after we've have research that shows their underrepresentation, and there are many programs to help to bridge that gap? Eagley and Canoe research suggests there are subtle barriers that women encounter that is relatively different from their counterpart or their male counterpart. So overall, there's progress in advancement of women into leadership role. However, women still lag behind men in general. So as I mentioned, 5% of women are CEO in the private sector, and first line managers 36%. So obviously that is nowhere near the amount of population, them being 59% of the actual workforce itself. So as I showed in the picture earlier, in which I was being given a 10-year award, what I noticed, as well as what data suggests, is that leadership is homogenous. And often it is not necessarily something that individuals are consciously aware of. As humans, in terms of human behavior, we tend to gravitate towards people who are like us, or people who have similar attributes and traits like us. And what does that mean? Often that means you choose people who may look like you or who may be the same gender. So the general goal of my research was to address the gap in empirical research on federal government civil services. This plethora of research on women leadership in general in the private sector, but not specific to the federal government, because the federal government is very unique. So I decided to do a single case study to explore the roles of social capital, human capital, and leader-member exchange didactic relationship in career advancement of women. Well, what does that really mean? What that really means is, to what extent does social capital help or play a role in the advancement of women in leadership role in the federal government? And to what extent does human capital play a role? And we know research suggests that mentorship plays a role in leadership advancement. In the US federal government, that is the supervisor and supervisor relationship. So what role does the supervisor-supervisor relationship play in the leadership advancement of women in the US federal government, GS 13 through 15? Later on, I will expand on exactly what does this GS 13 through 15 mean. It is a pay scale of leaders in the US federal government. So my research, I had 3 research questions. What role does human capital play in women manager leadership advancement in the US federal government civil service general GS 13 through 15? What role does social capital is conceptualized as network and relationship, play in women managers leadership advancement in the US federal government? And the third, what role does employee-employer didactic relationship play in women managers leadership advancement in US federal government? For those who may not be familiar with leadership theories, employee-employer didactic relationship simply is the relationship between supervisor and their managers, which is divided into 3 groups: the in group, the out group, and defense writers. Those who are in the in group tend to get the better project, mentorship, and resources. Therefore, they tend to advance higher. Those who are in the out group tend to encounter barriers, and those on the defense writer tend to have a combination of the 2. So specifically, as I mentioned earlier, what is GS 13 through 15? If you're not in the federal government, you may not know what that means. That is a pay scale of individuals who are managers. For GS 13, what does that mean in terms of salary? That is 102,000 all the way to 133,000. So obviously, these are people who are making relatively good money. These are people who are 6-figure salary managers. If you're GS 14, that is 121,000 through 157,000. And if you're GS 15, that's 142,000 through 170,000. And if you're a senior executive services, that starts at 131. As you can see, the higher end of each category is higher than the lower end of the next category. So if you're a GS 13 at the higher end, you're making 133,000, whereas a GS 14 at the beginning is making 121,000. Why a case study? Case study is an in-depth exploration of inquiry that investigate contemporary phenomena within real-life context. Why real-life context? So really we know the numbers of underrepresentation of women, but why? Why does it still continue now in 2021 or 2020? When behaviors cannot be manipulated, those who were interviewed, their behavior cannot be manipulated. They are sharing their lived experience in terms of their growth within the US federal government civil services. When contextual conditions are relevant to the phenomena under investigation. And then this gives more information on the differences, because there are very close relationship or close definition between a case study and phenomenology. Even within the definition of case study, there's the word phenomena. So depending on the university and the advisor that you have, a study like mine can relatively be categorized as either a case study or phenomenological study. And these are the references for each one. So the data collection analysis was semi-structured interviews in which the researcher myself was the instrument. It was purposeful sampling of 12 men and 26 women that were recruited. In general, there were the actual network and the purposeful sampling went out to about 500. And as you know, in general, in terms of recruitment, what is in it for me? So more than likely, you're only going to get about 10% of the actual population that you try to reach. So I was able to obtain 12 men and 26 women, a total of 38 participants. And engage in persistent observation, pre and post interviews, pre-recommendation. Each interviewee were provided the questions, the waiver, the RB approved questions that they would be asked. And each interview lasted between 45 minutes to 2.5 hours, depending on the interviewer or interviewee. And triangulation was used with audio recording and face-to-face interviews, member checks through for internal validity through transcripts and a software called MassQDA. The conceptual framework, social capital, human capital, leader-member exchange theory, and leadership advancement in the middle of the three lenses. So the participants in terms of their demographic, 26% of the participants had a bachelor's. Well, 100% of them had a bachelor's and 100% of them have masters. And interestingly enough, 10 of the 12 men had a doctoral degree. Three of the participants were GS 13 and 14 were GS 14 and 9 were not GS 15. The data for men was excluded because in my research, because the title was underrepresentation of women in top leadership roles, and my chair and committee did not think having that particular data in which the men had more education than the women would serve the purpose of the study. So the data for men were excluded. So how's education defined? It's formal schooling leading to a degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, or doctoral degree. The themes that were discovered based on the participants, pseudonym, Michelle, I will probably say my education was helpful. I have a degree in public administration and public policy, which leads me to some leadership positions. Eve, I am a big proponent on education and whatever new leadership strategies or ideas come about. This is in regards to the things that they felt and their experience helped them to advance to leadership roles. Work-related experience was the next theme, which was defined as knowledge, expertise, and wisdom a person gained from working in one or more positions. Jennifer stated, your expertise develops you. A quick note, some of these things may not be grammatically correct as we are going through the interview. Often the participants spoke in generalized terms that they may not be grammatically correct. So your expertise develops through your work and experiences. It is transferable to other positions, offices, agencies. Let's say you want a different opportunity somewhere else. It could be temporary or it could be permanent. It could be if you just want to go to a different department, branch or group, or different work area within your agency. So this is just the participants conveying how work-related experience helped them in their leadership advancement in the US federal government. The third theme that was discovered was leadership training, which is defined as agency-specific training that has a defined intake process or acceptance into a multifaceted program that includes development, maintenance, enhancements of leadership acumen, interpersonal relation, change management, conflict management. So Taylor mentioned, it has allowed me the opportunity to apply for more positions. Many positions that I have been looking at require advanced training. So an advanced knowledge and experience for the type of salary that I look for. So I will say throughout my professional career, those particular classes and conferences, all of that. So essentially, these are the things that this particular interviewee perceived as factors that helped her in leadership advancement within the US federal government. Professional certification was the fourth theme that was identified. Michelle, I have a project management professional certification. Molly, I have certification in federal acquisition. Hillary, I have equal employment opportunity certification. Kimberly, I have program management professional certification. Holly, I have a certification in change management. Nicole has certification in conflict management, and so on and so forth. So moving on to the second research question on the role that social capital play in leadership advancement in the US federal government. Social capital is a very broad area. So conceptually, it was defined as a sense of belonging, networking for bonding and bridging, feelings of trust and safety, reciprocity, participation, citizen power, and proactive values, norms, outlook, and life. So in regards to networking relationship for leadership advancement for women in the US federal government, a supportive system of sharing information, commonalities, goals, and services among groups or individuals within a common interest. Lucy on diversity stated, I think my network is very vast in that it goes from an individual that dropped out of high school all the way through doctors, lawyers, president of the United States of America. And these findings are supported by other previous research by Babcock, Lean, and Thomas, and Ruxey, 2009. Social capital is very fragile because it entails trust, and trust takes time to build, but it can be broken in a very short period of time. So one of the things that was identified in building social capital is trust. And trust is the ability to have reliance on the integrity of an employee or supervisor, and it takes time to build. However, it is easily broken if there are inconsistencies between what is spoken and what is actually done. And what they're referring to in this is between policies or things that are written down versus the behaviors that they see in leadership behaviors as well as within their peers. Ashley stated, trust is people feeling like you can get the job done. Maria stated, when people feel like you can get the job done, that means they trust you. Emma, there are certain boundaries you do not cross. You have to keep that professionalism going. And trust is one of the components of social capital, according to previous research named on the right. Cameron mentioned, in addition to trust, is a sense of belonging in terms of a networking relationship. My network includes others because my office is majority white and mainly Black women that are also GS-14 and above. We started around the same time in the agency. What Cameron is really saying is that in her role, her office is predominantly Caucasian, and she networks with other African-American women who are GS-14 within her office. Helen on values, norms, and outlook in life. One of the components of social capital is shared values, norms, and outlook on life. And Helen mentioned, you're amongst people that you have something in common with or a common interest outside of work. That is always a good thing. What was found is that the social capital or networking relationships do not occur necessarily in the workplace. Some of the participants mentioned that the networking were formed within their parent-teacher associations, within their children's schools, within a common identification, such as a Jewish community or a Chinese church community or an African American or Asian specific group community. So the social capital are built in different realms. And I will talk more about the human capital intersectionality of the social capital and human capital in the third research question. So Holly mentioned, going back to the research question 2, the way things are designed, it's more who you know. You meet people to network and not anything else. Obviously, Holly's perspective is different from Helen. Helen is saying these are people that I have things in common with outside of work. Holly mentioned that these are designed specifically to network and nothing else. So obviously there's variability in the reasons for networking relationship within the participants interviewed. Research suggests that mentoring is one of the factors in leadership advancement for men and women. So how is mentorship defined? Is the act of providing influence, guidance, advice, sharing insights and expertise for betterment of individual being advised. And Molly mentioned her experience with mentoring. Mentoring is very important. I would advise finding or being a mentor. Nia, my supervisor does not mentor me, but I believe mentoring is important. Ashley mentioned, by all means, find a mentor, someone you admire. Doesn't have to be in your department or office. I wanted to go back to Nia's perspective on her supervisor not mentoring her. In research, the research suggests that mentoring is important and is important to find a mentor. As a practitioner, that is not always a straightforward thing. So let's just say, for example, there's an individual that could be a good mentor. There may be multiple people who want that person to mentor them. They may not choose to mentor you, even if you want them to mentor you. So there's a side of competition or access to mentoring that differ among individuals. The fact that one wants to be mentored does not necessarily provide access in practice versus from the research perspective of the need for mentorship. And this is also supported by Clanky, who is a woman researcher who has really done a lot of work on women leadership. So Clanky 2003, Prescott 2016, Blake and Beard 2011. They mentioned the importance of mentoring and also the differences in access to mentorship. The theme in research question 3 on leadership behavior, communication, and collaboration. And that is defined as the communication and collaboration is defined as face-to-face discussion, written communication in a manner in which they work together for the common goal. Furthermore, it entails finding mutual beneficial outcomes and constructive feedback. And Helen mentioned the importance of observing as well as being part of a collaborative leadership behavior. It is important because you will not get to achieve greater leadership responsibility without having good communication. Angelina mentioned it's not just communication, but how they communicate, how they listen, give feedback, and ask for input. Zoe mentioned, I will probably go back to communication and collaboration. And here, both Helen, Angelina, and Zoe are alluding to the importance of leadership behavior as well as communication and collaboration, specifically in the behavior that they notice and put a high value on in leadership behavior. And these are also supported by previous research by Atwater and Camelli, 2009, Day 2014, Abby and Ellen, 2012, and Narang and Bergson, 2007. And now we get to the supervisor-supervisor relationship in group, in leadership theory. This is called LMX, member leader exchange theory, which has the in-group, the out-group, and the individuals who are in between. The in-group entails a high-quality supervisor-subordinate relationship, which includes mutual respect, trust, and negotiation leverage. Participants who could relate to the in-group mentioned inclusion and support. And she's referring to a supervisor, as I quote, "He's pretty good, I would say supportive of my development, and someday when I leave this position and maybe go on to executive position somewhere else, he will definitely be supportive of that." Supportive of what she's saying, that this person will sponsor her in terms of aligning her with resources and individual to be successful. Obviously, that's more than what is required as a supervisor. So this is mentorship as well as advocacy. Vanessa mentioned inclusion. I think I've been fortunate to acquire mentors, advocates, people who have sort of taken me under their wing. Everyone is not that fortunate. Once again, what Vanessa is alluding to is that her experience has been very positive, but she also realized that may not necessarily be the norm or the case for everyone. In previous research that suggested differences in supported supervisor or in-group and out-in-group specifically are listed on the right. Now, to the second tier of the leader-member exchange theory, or supervisor-supervisory relationship, on how it's conceptualized within the federal government. It's the out-group statement is defined as the out-group in didactic supervisor-supervisory relationship entails a low-quality supervisor-subordinate relationship, which entails less negotiation leverage and trust. Participants who can relate to the out-group, Shakira mentioned on exclusion. So the majority is the same racial demographic. So I believe the trust is already established. We already know the struggles and biases of getting promotions as Black women or getting jobs where we are. So as a Black woman, we already trust each other first, then the job, or learn about other jobs around the agency. Angelina mentioned, I don't have a good supervisor-supervisory relationship right now. It's kind of cliquish, you know how it is. They kind of know who they want. And what Angelina is expressing here is the differences in organizational behavior, leadership behavior in practice, as experienced in practice versus policies that may be written down. And often sometimes doing the research, it's easier than the actual practice and reality. In previous research that support that are Artwater and Cameli 2009, Day 2014, and others listed on the right. So interpretation. So the finding of the study reinforced previous research finding that suggests that accumulation of human capital varies in general and helps with career advancement. The study is different in that it's specific to federal government civil service employees in the GS 13 through 15 pay scale. In addition, the study by Jones, 2013, and Murphy and Welch, 1989, suggested that traits of individuals bring to the workplace largely depends on the resources built through work-related experience, leadership training, and formal education. All participants participated in some form of leadership training held by their organization and add an average of 12 years of work experience. So obviously this is the human capital component in which they have both the education and the degrees and certification, as well as the work experience. Moreover, it supports the agency barrier analysis report, U.S. federal government civil service 462 report, statistical report of exclusion and discrimination complaints. for those who are not familiar with the federal government, this is a report that is published annually. Social capital. The themes of networking, relationships, and trust align with previous study on the role of social capital for career advancement and economic growth. It differs that it did not include the intersectionality of social capital and human capital in general and federal government public administration specifically. What does this really mean? So this is where the intersection of social capital and human capital. So for some participants and for some leaders, their human capital creates the social capital. And this happens through individuals or participants who attended a leadership training or a specific university, a specific school. They form groups post-graduation, and they use that human capital connection to build social capital to help one another to find and navigate projects, jobs, and supervisors. And they maintain that throughout their career upon graduation. So this also supports a different agency report that is also published called the United States Federal Government Civil Service MD 715, which is a report on diversity and inclusion in general, and also the data on participants on leadership training that is specific to demographics. This includes, there are leadership training specific for women as a whole, regardless of demographic. And then within that, individuals have Asian American leadership groups, African American leadership group, Hispanic American leadership group, Jewish American leadership group, Chinese American leadership groups. So there are layers to the different leadership groups and social capital that is built within the human capital component. Now to the leader-member exchange theory, or in-group and out-group. 26 of the women participants and 11 of the 12 men participants believe that employee-employer didactic relationship plays a major role in career advancement and leadership roles years 13 through 15. 17 of the participants provide examples of good and challenging employee-employer relationship. And leader-member exchange theory, or LMX, differ by demographics due to being a minority with less leaders who they share demographic identity, values, and similarity. Going back to the first one on the 26 women participants and 11 of the men who believe that didactic relation play a role, what this is alluding to is that your supervisor has the option and the choice to mentor you if they choose. And they also have the discretion to provide resources to help you grow, but it is not required for them to do so. So if you have affinity towards a certain employee or choose to mentor them, it plays a significant role in their leadership advancement. It shortened the times of their leadership advancement trajectory. The study also reinforced study by Cho 2013 and Fitzsimmons, Callahan, and Paulson 2017 on continuous barriers despite improvements in diversity and inclusion mandates and policy. Trust is essential in high quality relationships. Due to previous research on the low number of women in top leadership roles, there have been many policies as well as many research that have come forward. And because of the policies and procedures that have been put in place, there's growth. However, in addition to having a policy in place, there's qualitative human behavior practices that are harder to measure and to execute, which helps to keep the barriers alive in the experiences of many participants, as well as the federal government in general. It also supports similar findings by the by other federal agencies on disparities of men and women scientists that were funding grants and salaries. In general, many people have heard that on average, women make about 89 cents to $1 that a man of equal position makes. There are other research that have alluded to the fact that grantees and their salaries with the same education and background differ by gender. It also asked the Women Leadership Gap study by Warner and Elmer and Bush 2018 that was published in the Center for American Progress on Need for More Women Leaders. The limitation of the study, as mentioned earlier, this is a case study, which means it is specific to the individuals who were interviewed or who chose to be interviewed. It is not generalizable, and is also limited to the geographical area of Washington, D.C., United States metropolitan area. This selection was a snowball effect or sample, and is limited by gender and pay grade of GS 13 through 15 managers. The significance, it has the potential to positively inform and influence decision-making and management practices. Each US president has something called the President's Management Agenda, Circular A11, Part 6, Annual Agency Mandated Barrier Analysis Report 462, which analyzes and reports barriers as well as discrepancies between gender and leadership roles. It adds to the current body of empirical research of federal government civil service managers and helps and inform leadership training and leadership advancement program, practitioner, researcher, and organizational practice. Another specific US government report, Annual Agency Mandate Barrier Analysis Report, MD 715, Diversity and Inclusion Management Directives. This is also another policy and report that comes out every year to help or to better inform of the current demographic between the current state, the desired state, and the future state of inclusion to increase and maintain more women in leadership roles. Recommendation, more empirical research on GS 13 through 15 federal government managers, inclusion of other demographic and geographical areas outside of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, extend the research to ethnic minority women such as Asian American, Hispanic American, Native American. This particular study had African American, Caribbean American, some Asian American, 2 Hispanic American. There were no Native Americans. So future recommendation is to expand it to include more Asian American, Hispanic American, and Native Americans. And incentivize mentors. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that you want a mentor and you align yourself with a mentor does not mean that the mentor wants to mentor you. They have to have an incentive. It's additional role that they are taking on. In a practical or practitioner perspective, there continues to be barriers. And one way that those barriers can be minimized or decreased is to incentivize the mentors. Human Capital Operation Plan, it's another publication for the federal government that is used by agencies for continuous improvement in leadership training and advancement. One of the reasons that came about is because as human beings or human behavior, we gravitate towards those who are like us. So unknowingly, sometimes that also means that we have unconscious bias. So I would choose somebody who looks like me because we played the same sport, we went to the same school, we grew up in the same area. So we have similarities. So it's important to learn how to not just gravitate towards those that we like or who have similarities to us, but those who have different perspective, different abilities, different genders, different backgrounds, etc. Thank you. And any questions?
I have the question. If I see it right, you one of your key findings is the central role of mentorship. I absolutely agree with you. It was interesting that you analyzed this. What I ask me, which incentives can the agency or the government give to provide not only formal mentorship, but mentorship which works? You see that people don't just subscribe and say, I will be a mentor, but really be there for their mentee and really provide resources and the best advice they can give.
All right, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Jacob. So one of the challenges of mentorship is that it can come with it can come at a liability. All mentorship mentee relationship are not positive. So one of the ways to incentivize mentors could be perhaps having an award ceremony in which they are formally recognized, and providing them with a plaque. So something like that is very cost efficient. It wouldn't burden the organization financially. It wouldn't significantly burden them financially, but it will be an appreciation that will be meaningful to many mentees. Because often, and a lot of mentors mentor without any formal incentives. And in my study, many of the participants, 75% of the participants, engage in informal mentoring because of the need for trust. In formal relationships or formal mentoring relationship, they indicated that often some individuals encounter challenges into getting into a mentorship program. So often they are mentored by people who they have similarities with, or people that are referred to, or people that someone in their network helped to advocate for them. So for some of them, it was, we're part of a Jewish community, and because I know you like this type of projects, I'm going to talk to my friend who is the head of this department and see if you can do a detail. A detail is a short-term experience in which someone can go somewhere else and learn an additional skill and bring it back to the office to add value to the current office that they're in. So that's one of the ways that the participants shared how they gained that, is through their interpersonal relationships that is aligned with their demographic identity.
Okay, any other questions? Okay.
I've got a question, actually. Thanks very much for sharing. I'm interested in how did you approach trust in your interviews? How did you explore it?
So the way that trust was explored is by asking the participants how they build networking relationship and what are the pros and cons that they encounter in building that relationship. And trust was one of the sub themes that emerged in those interviews. And trust was defined differently based on each participant. Some define trust as the ability to get the work done, which you can technically say that's competence. But that's how they perceived it. And it differed from one individual to the next. Some build trust through their gender identity based on their office. As I mentioned earlier, one of the participants or some of the participants expressed that in their particular department, they were predominantly Caucasian, so they built trust with other African American women, in part because of their shared racial identity, and others in part because they started their professional career around the same time. And over the years of working together, they have learned the behaviors of each person. And they mentioned that you learn to trust by watching what people do, not what they say. And what they were trying to say in that is that, often there are discrepancies between what is said and the behavior of what they do in terms of what is carried out. I can verbally say, I support you as your supervisor to do to take on additional training and certifications. But if I'm not approving the resources, the funding for you to do so, the behavior does not support what I'm verbally communicating. So often the participant mentioned that in addition to what is said, what you really need to pay attention to the behaviors that are displayed.
I have a question. Perhaps have you ever incurred any literature which compares the level of trust in the private and in the public sector when you did your literature check?
Yeah, so there are a lot of research for public sector and private sector on trust, but the way that it's experienced is very different, and it is not the same for everyone. So while trust is a challenge or is important in building relationship in both private sector and public sector, the way that is interpreted is different. And what I mean by the way it's interpreted is different is that the definition and perception of trust varies between individuals, between offices, and between organizations. And also the culture changes when new leader comes on board. And when new leader come on board, as the culture changes, the trust also changes because it takes time to build. So it's very fluid.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question, Will, about particularly about diversity, because I think a lot of the social capital literature assumes that where you have variety in ethnicity or religion or even gender, you tend to get less social capital overall. But I think a lot of these studies are correlational. They basically see that where there is diversity, there is less social capital in the way that they measure it, and perhaps don't explore some of the reasons why that might be the case. And I think you've sort of touched on some of those reasons around, social identity and you feeling similarity with other people who are like you. But I think the question is often asked about what we can do to change that. How can we address this issue? If old white men are in leadership positions and they're likely to want to promote other old white men, then how do we change the norms or the attitudes that people have towards people who are different and diversity? Through your research, did you pick up on anything that we could perhaps do?
Yes. So one of the things that was picked up is that when you talk about inclusion, equity, diversity, sometimes the two things. Often we rely on differences that are noticeable. So some of the participants, they were all Caucasian men, but within themselves, they consider themselves very diverse because you have someone who is of Jewish descent, you have somebody who is German, you have somebody who's from another European country. Like their nationalities and faiths were different, even though they have similar or identical racial identification. In addition to that, it's differences in perspectives. Also, it encounters, it's like a change management in general, you encounter a pushback. So if you're in order to tolerate, in order to celebrate difference in perspective, one has to also be self-aware of your own bias so that you can be open to a different perspective, because diversity is inclusive of different perspectives. And in order to be inclusive of different perspectives, we have to check our own biases. Everyone is biased because to some extent, bias is a survival mechanism, right? So we have to be aware of our biases so that we can put corrective action and corrective behavior in place. And often sometimes, so unintentionally, we can hire people who are diverse, but we want them to behave like the rest of the group. So you lose the benefit of the diversity because I hire a woman, but I want her to behave like all the other men that I've hired. Or I hire a Black woman and I want her to behave like the other Caucasian woman that I've hired. Not intentionally, but because the socialization of organizational culture sometimes push that without realizing it. So a lot of learning and relearning unconscious bias is one step to help with the corrective behavioral change. Because at this point, it's not just a policy change, it's behavior, is leadership and human behavioral changes.
So are you aware of, or do you know of any training or sort of, leadership activities that specifically try to address any of these kinds of issues?
Yes, within the US federal government, there are tons of diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Often all employees have to participate or take those training annually. And those training are great. The challenge is the difference between taking a training and a behavior in a meeting that you need to self-correct or you might be blind to are very the practice is the challenge. The training in itself, it's there. So the training is there, but the practice of checking our own behavior in real life or being aware of it, that's where we definitely need more work. And often is not as clear cut, or there's no incentive to do so. If I am the leader and I want to hire and behave in ways that may not send a message of inclusivity, if there aren't any accountability or repercussions, why should I?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I guess that sort of begs the question, is the training actually being effective? Because, with the training, ideally you want to shift people's attitudes. So not just that they understand the issues, because, you can teach somebody, they can understand the issues, but that their actual value system changes so that they don't need, that becomes the incentive because they want to, because they do believe it, not just understand it. So is there perhaps maybe, and I don't really need you to answer this question, but I was sort of speculating that perhaps the training could be improved.
The repercussions for speaking up in real practice on one of the ways that research suggests changing or increasing diversity, inclusion, and equity is by having individuals who are not impacted to speak up for those who are impacted. So if I'm in a meeting and someone says something that is sexist, I, as a man, choose to speak up for women, even though it doesn't impact me or influence me. And in real life, sometimes, from a practitioner standpoint, if and when you do speak out, there could be repercussions, and those repercussions can affect your career. And because of those repercussions, people in practice would think twice to do so in certain circumstances.
Absolutely, because you're talking about third-party sanctioning. And so typically you only really see third-party sanctioning where there's the norm is extremely strong. and people feel like there aren't going to be too many repercussions of speaking up. And if the norm isn't very strong, then third-party sanctioning doesn't tend to happen anywhere near as much. But I think I'm interested in this partly because being an Australian and living in New Zealand, that we have a lot of diversity in both countries, in Australia and New Zealand. But my experience certainly has been that there isn't very much in the way of diversity training, and sort of awareness about these kinds of issues. And I think in part it's because there is a problem. Like, I'm not saying that there isn't, more old white guys, in Australia and New Zealand, but I think that in general, Australians tend to be quite accepting of other ethnicities and other races and genders and gender options and all that sort of thing. That seems to be a bit more acceptance of that. And I certainly haven't experienced very much in the way of, specific diversity training that occurs. I've worked in the Australian government, and I wasn't exposed to any of that. And so, I think the difference between the United States and Australia is quite an interesting dynamic. There's not really any difference in the diversity in each country, but the way in which the government approaches it seems to be quite different. And also, not only that, but the United States doesn't necessarily seem to be having better results than Australia, even though there seems to be more effort going into it.
Yeah, right. Quite interesting. This is a graph of CEOs. Obviously, we have more women in leadership roles, but the CEOs in S&P 500 companies are still less than 6%. The top earners, 11%. The board of directors, 21%. So overall, we still have a lot of work to do. And at least in the United States, in the areas that I have experienced in, the practice needs to be merged with the actual training. And the practice is individualized and vary from office to office, from person to person, from organization to organization, and really paying attention and listening. If Emily comes to me and said that, well, we don't have as many women in certain roles, you could get a response that maybe there aren't as many women who are interested. We just can't get them. That would be some of the male response that Emily may encounter, which means you're not really listening. Because we need to feel comfortable with our own bias. And in order to improve that, it's not a personal attack. We've all been socialized to some extent in differences between the genders. So really learning more about our own bias and corrective action in our daily lives will help, even from in every aspect, because it's not just working. I happen to be someone who runs, and some of my friends who run told me stories of being whistled at and things of that nature. I, as a man, never experienced it. So until they shared it with me, I was just like, oh, wow, I didn't know. But by them sharing it with me, now I'm more conscientious and I pay more attention. And when they are running, if something happens, I will speak up for them because now it's in my radar. So similar to the workforce, you have to first listen so that we can understand, not trying to rationalize that it's something else. And that will go a long way in the practice. Like I said, the policies are easier because the policies are driven in part by liability. If you get sued, then you have a need to put policies in place and put training in place. But the actual behavior in real life, in practice, it's hard to manage, and it's hard to quantify. It's hard to change because it happens so quickly, and it's right then and there. What we all can do is be more open-minded and speak up for individuals and groups who may be at a disadvantage, and recognize our own privilege. I, as a man, simply by being a man, have privilege that I'm not aware of or that I didn't even earn just the fact that I'm a man, and a woman will know certain things that I would know because the privilege blinds me. And until I'm open-minded enough to hear from a woman perspective, I may not be aware of the privilege that I have and how I can use that privilege to help someone who is not as privileged or who doesn't have a certain type of privilege.
Absolutely. And I think we're sort of talking about some areas where there's some overlap between human capital and social capital. You know, the sorts of, you know, empathy and theory of mind is really a human capital property. You know, it's a skill that individuals have and that individuals can develop, and you can have training for, you know, empathy or theory of mind to be able to understand other people's perspectives. And being able to understand other people's perspectives and what they're going through, and basically having empathy for other people, is closely related to building social capital, to having social capital at that individual level. And so, you know, I think there's quite a few of these sort of aspects or skills or capabilities that individuals can possess that relate to social capital that perhaps haven't been explored quite as much as they could be.
Absolutely. Definitely a lot of room for further research.
Okay, everyone, we are a bit over our time already, so I would suggest that we come to an end. Thank you so much, William, for your very interesting presentation to this topic, which is quite of relevance, and I think it's also highly in discussion. I think it deepened our insight about the importance of social capital in promoting diversity. And yeah, I will be glad to hear further of your research, and thanks so much again for your presentation that you gave us tonight.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for providing the opportunity and resource to present.
Thanks, Will. Really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
So then I think I wish everyone a good evening or good morning or whatever time it is in your place.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.